can do so. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nidhi, who I think is going to start the presentation. We'll hear from the presenters. They'll then be, we'll then hear from Nafisa, and there'll be time for discussion. If you've got comments and questions, please do put them in the chat as things go on, and we will be able to collate them and be ready for time for responses at the end. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Pauline. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much for joining us. Even though it's just Larry and me presenting today, I just want to start by acknowledging the huge efforts made by everyone who supported us and worked with us in producing this report and doing this research work. So colleagues at the Real Center, Tetra Tech, Fab Inc., and very importantly, country teams where the data was collected. Huge thanks to all of you, and most importantly, to the girls with disabilities themselves, their families and communities. None of this would have been possible without the time they gave us. So having acknowledged the huge contribution everyone has made, I also acknowledge the fact that some of you are aware of what GEC is. As Pauline said, quite a few of you are involved in Girls Education Challenge. But I'm going to start by giving a very small overview of GEC to just situate the study. The Girls Education Challenge was launched in 2012. Phase 2 of the program started in 2017, and it's going to go on till 2025. It receives approximately 500 million UK pounds to support 41 projects operating in 17 different countries. And through this fund, it's managed through manages 2 different windows. The GEC transitions, or the GEC T, and you'll see that said quite often in the presentation, the GEC T window and the Leave No Girl Behind, or the LNGB window. The LNGB projects are the more recent projects and are of particular relevance to disability, given that they have a very explicit focus on the most marginalized girls. But we're covering both the GEC T and the LNGB projects in this particular evaluation. There are 2 expected outcomes of GEC II, and that is improve learning outcomes for marginalized girls. That's the first big outcome that they're looking at. And indeed, the second one is around increased transition through key stages of education, training, or employment. The study which we are going to be discussing is the 4th in the series, which Pauline mentioned, of the independent evaluation of GEC II, and its thematic focus is on disability. The GEC follows the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities approach to looking at disability. That's a very strongly anchored human rights approach. It draws on Article 1 of the UN CRPD when defining disability, which basically states that those who have a long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. Now, this is a really important definition, which I want to acknowledge because it moves disability away from a very traditional, solely medical-based perspective, which is focused only on physical deficits or impairments, to one really which encompasses the attitudinal, environmental, and institutional barriers that can limit or exclude people with disabilities from wider participation on an equal basis in society. So it really takes on a very enriching biopsychosocial approach to understanding disability. Within the broader literature, girls with disabilities are often highlighted as having double disadvantage or multiple disadvantage, both as a result of their gender and ability. But they also intersect with other variables such as class, status, health status, location in which they're located, rural, urban areas in different countries, which result in multiple levels of disadvantages and discrimination against girls with disabilities. Now, this is very well acknowledged, and there's a lot of literature around it, but there is a significant lack of research on the educational needs, experiences, and outcomes of girls with disabilities. And this is due to a whole range of reasons, which could include lack of funding for disability programs and other measures around data collection tools, and so on. Hence, through this project, we were very keen on filling an important gap in our current understandings around the lives of girls with disabilities. Larry, could I request you to move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So the primary objective of the study was to understand in what ways were the GEC II projects engaging with girls with disabilities through the interventions and the perceived and observed effects of these approaches on the girls' learning and socio-emotional well-being, including in the engagement with peers, teacher educators, caregivers, and families. So we've adopted 2 research questions. So one was very much in relation to looking at what the current status was, and how these interventions had also included girls with disabilities during COVID-19, and the factors which were influencing the decisions, that is the implementing partners' decisions to include girls with disabilities. So that became RQ1. And then the RQ2 very much was a deep dive in really looking at the perceived and observed effects from the perspective of the girls with disabilities and their significant others. I'm going to spend the next 2 minutes or so just talking through the research methods which we used. So moving on to the next slide, Larry, please. Thank you. So the research question 1, we primarily use secondary data, primarily. So we use both quantitative and qualitative data covering all the 41 projects. So this included external evaluations which had been done previously at various points, regularly submitted project monitoring reports, and indeed COVID-19 response reports. And in addition to the secondary analysis, which was very primarily quantitative driven, but not exclusively, we had also narrative reports which we looked at and analyzed through qualitative approaches. We also interviewed project implementing partners. So of the 41 projects, we were able to interview 27 project implementing partners to really provide their perspectives of their rationales for including girls with disabilities and what kind of interventions were they focusing on. Moving on to the methods we used for RQ2. So here we decided to go for, as I said, a deep dive. We adopted 3 case study projects, and we were very committed to collecting data, engaging with girls with disabilities, the primary beneficiaries themselves, their parents or caregivers, teachers, community groups, and government representatives. The methods which we used here were very much primarily qualitative methods, ranging from semi-structured interviews, focus group discussions, classroom observations, to very much participatory methods such as photo voice and audio notes to collect data from the girls with disabilities. And you will hear in the findings some really powerful insights which we gathered through these different techniques. So we identified 3 case studies. So one was VSO Nepal, the second was Link Education Malawi, and in Uganda we had Viva Crane. And the criteria for selection for these projects was very much projects which had a very strong and explicit focus on girls with disabilities in the intervention. And of course, willingness and time to participate in this deep dive. All 3 projects are doing something very exciting. They're also doing something very different. For example, in Nepal, they have bridge classes, which are being held. These are 9-month catch-up classes for girls with disabilities who are out of school. In Malawi, they have community-based education centers, again, to provide a link between mainstream and out-of-school girls. And in Uganda, they have different kinds of learning centers, again, trying to provide the link with mainstream systems for out-of-school girls. All of them also had very interesting vocational training, teacher training, and social components like peer clubs, engagement with family and community members. So these were really rich data sites, rich interventions, which we found really useful to engage with, and really had some really thoughtful discussions with the girls with disabilities there themselves. What is really useful to also note at the outset is that even though we had made significant efforts to collect a lot of data, we did have issues with limited availability of project data, especially in relation to the quant analysis. So what was possible to do in terms of analyze changes over time, etc., establish causal links, etc., were much more difficult. There were sampling issues. So for instance, even though we wanted to interview all the 41 implementing partners, we only ended up interviewing 27. And in the qualitative, we wanted to get a whole range of different disabilities, but we were very much constrained by what the project partners were doing in these contexts. Nonetheless, I'm pretty confident our findings provide some really interesting and useful insights into the impact these different interventions were having on the lives of girls with disabilities and their families. And to present the findings, I'm going to invite my colleague Larry to take that forward. So over to you, Larry.
Thank you so much, Nidhi, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'll be talking through the main findings of our study and also the key reflections from our findings. I'll first go through the findings from our RQ1, which is at the portfolio level, and then RQ2, which is more case study level. So prevalence of disability in the project beneficiaries. So the review of external evaluation reports show that all the projects basically use the Washington Group short set questionnaire with girls to identify their functioning in the following 6 domains. These were seeing, hearing, walking, self-care, communication, and remembering. In addition to this, all LNGB projects, which are the Leave No Girl Behind projects, as Nidhi previously mentioned, they administered the Washington Group module on child functioning to identify and screen them on additional domains of learning, concentrating, accepting change, controlling behavior, making friends, anxiety, and depression. So we use the girls data over baseline to identify project beneficiaries. We found that 9% of girls in GEC transition and 14% of girls in LNGB sample data reported at least one disability. The variation in the disability prevalence estimates is due to 2 different tools, which is the Washington Group short set and the CFM being used across projects. The LNGB projects used CFM, and resultantly, we saw that they identified a high prevalence of anxiety and depression, and a greater percentage of girls reported at least one disability. In terms of the engagement of Project IPs with, these are the implementing partners with girls with disabilities, multiple interventions for the girls were conducted across the different areas. The largest focus was on teacher training. 23 projects implemented interventions related to teacher training. 23 projects again implemented interventions that incorporated some elements of peer activities such as peer clubs, mentorships. Then 22 projects incorporated elements of community engagement. These included awareness campaigns, and having community members as more active participants in the projects as well. And 22 projects also provided assistive devices. We also asked the project IPs in our interviews about their reasons for including girls with disabilities in their interventions and having interventions that particularly focused on their needs, such as the provision of assistive devices. And the project IPs spoke about how they recognize the multiple levels and the double disadvantage of marginalization that impacted the lives of the girls with disabilities, and that was their strongest motivating factor for including girls with disabilities in their interventions. Additionally, some IPs also emphasize how resource constraints restricted their ability and the extent to which they could target girls with disabilities. And importantly, IPs also spoke about FCDO's funding push that happened in 2018. FCDO increased its focus on disability and inclusive education in 2018, and there was a funding push towards it, and IPs expressed how they increased the number of interventions that were targeting girls with disabilities following that funding push, and that really motivated them to include more girls with disabilities in their interventions. In terms of the outcomes, we saw changes in literacy and numeracy outcomes of girls with disabilities. This is based on the quantitative analysis of the entire portfolio of projects. And we saw that for both GEC-T and LNGB, there were improvements between baseline outcomes and midline outcomes in terms of the literacy and numeracy skills. In GEC-T, girls with disabilities who received the interventions showed improvements in learning beyond girls that did not receive the interventions. They also showed improvements above girls without disabilities. The results were statistically significant when project-specific weights were not added. Um, and so the result is statistically insignificant when project-specific weights are added, and hence the increase could be driven by two high-performing GEC-T projects, which had a very high number of girls with disabilities. These were by BRAC and CAMFIT. For LNGB, there was also an increase in the literacy and numeracy outcomes of girls with disabilities as compared to those of girls without disabilities, but these results were only statistically significant in the case of numeracy skills. Our RQ2, on the other hand, showed how through our RQ2, we saw the effects of the GEC2 projects as perceived by the girls with disabilities, who all unanimously spoke about how there was an increase in their learning outcomes as perceived by them, and then increase in their ability to read and write. They also spoke about how there was an increase in their socio-emotional skills, including more positive interactions with community members, with their families, with their peers, with their neighbors, and also an increase in the self-confidence. This was also reiterated by all other stakeholders. As Nidhi mentioned before, we did not just speak to girls with disabilities, we also spoke to their parents, caregivers, teachers, educators, and also their community members. And all of these other participants also spoke about how they could see a positive change in the girls, an increase in their ability to read and write, an increase in their social skills, an increase in their confidence levels, which was heartwarming to see. Now, coming over to the main question that we're trying to answer through our presentation today, what are the interventions that support the learning outcomes of girls with disabilities? Here, I'll be talking about some of the key reflections that we had from our study and from our data. So firstly, it's important to get the basics right. Although the girls did speak about an increase in their access to schools, an increase in their learning outcomes, there were certain fundamental barriers that still existed for girls with disabilities that did not just impact them, that impacted all girls. These barriers were particularly highlighted through the use of photo voice in our case study projects. Through the photo voice, girls were able to present photographs based on prompts that we gave them. The prompts included, what do you like about your school? What are the challenges that you find about your school? And what are the changes that you have found? When the girls were presenting photographs based on the challenges, we could see that there were certain fundamental barriers that impacted their access to school and impacted their learning. This included lack of classroom resources. As you can see in this picture, this one girl presented a picture of the classroom mat and spoke about how there were no chairs to sit on, and then they would sit on the mat, which was uncomfortable. There was a lack of hygienic toilets, and multiple girls presented from Malawi in particular, presented photographs of toilets and how they were not hygienic and not accessible. Then there's also this picture on infrastructural issues, and this was also prevalent in a lot of the photo voice data that we gathered, that there was a lack of thatched roofs. This one girl who presented the picture of the roof at my school, which is the third picture here, spoke about how, because the roof wasn't thatched, that created a barrier for her to learn, because when there was too much sunlight, then it would be difficult for her to concentrate, and when there would be rain, then she would get wet, her clothes would get wet, her books would get wet, and because of that, it would be difficult for her to continue the class and to continue to learn. So these were the barriers faced by all girls, and so interventions that get these basic fundamental needs right can have a greater impact on the lives of girls with disabilities, and not just on the lives of girls with disabilities and the learning of girls with disabilities, but all girls whose learning was being impacted by the lack of certain fundamental resources. On the other hand, we did find the girls did speak a lot about specialist support in the classrooms that really helped their learning. So resources and adaptations that particularly were highlighted by the girls included the use of Braille and sign language during teaching, the provision of assistive devices such as crutches, wheelchairs for girls with physical disabilities, hearing aids for girls with hearing impairments, And then a lot of girls also spoke about accommodations during learning assessments, such as large print stimuli, additional time for task completion that really helped them, aided them in their ability to give the exams as well and in their ability to learn. The girls also appreciated the support that was provided by the teachers in the classrooms. This included giving the students extra attention, changing their seating arrangement so that they were sitting in the front, that the board was clearer for them. So the girls really did overwhelmingly speak about the support of teachers. Teachers, on the other hand, spoke about the need for greater training and especially specialist support for them. For instance, in the use of Braille and in the use of sign language in the classrooms, they did speak about being overwhelmed and how they needed more support in the classroom in the form of sign language assistants or in the use of Braille. And when that's something that can really aid the learning of girls with disabilities in the classroom, as expressed by the teachers and as expressed by the girls as well. One important component of our study was the vocational and life skills training and the impact of vocational and life skills training on the girls. This was especially relevant for girls who had already been enrolled in these vocational training courses and had started earning or had started even small businesses of their own. For these girls in particular, there was an increase in their agency as exercised both at home and in schools. And the life skills training and the vocational training was able to help foster a positive sense of self for them. I'll give an example of agency over here. So there was this one girl in Uganda who spoke about how she was being teased in the classroom, and then she went up to the teacher and complained about it and took action. This was an example of her exercising agency, because she spoke about how before this she would not have gone up to the teacher and complained about this, but now she felt that she could. Vocational and life skills training in this sense really empowered the girls in fostering this sense of self in them. Another and for not just fostering a sense of self in them, but also making them think about their future and having high aspirations for their future. High aspirations for the future were also highlighted through this activity that we conducted during our focus group discussions with the girls. Both girls with and without disabilities attended these focus group discussions, and through these focus group discussions we asked the girls to conceptualize a successful woman with disability and a successful woman without disability. As you can see in this picture, when conceptualizing the woman with disability, the girls were asked to explain the characteristics of that woman and also to draw out that woman. And it was such an interesting activity because through this activity, the girls really highlighted the importance of being educated and how important it was for a woman, how success for them meant that the woman was financially independent, had a stable job, and there was no difference in the successful woman with and without disability. The girls displayed particular admiration for successful women in a position of power, suggesting a range of possible and varied professions for them, such as teaching, farming, healthcare, engineering, fashion designing. So the possibilities in their minds for successful women with disabilities were endless, which was again heartwarming to see. And they also highlighted the importance of being educated and how education would lead to a brighter future for them, would help them in their ability to earn, will help them in their future to become more successful. And there was more of a focus on financial independence and having jobs as compared to getting married. So this was something that we could see in the case of all girls, but particularly for the case of girls who had received this vocational and life skills training and who were already earning incomes. And another important aspect of that we found through the study was that when community members were involved as active participants in the interventions, that had a positive impact not just on the awareness, on the education of girls with disability, but all girls, but also the way the way the community members interacted with girls. The involvement of community members was effective in fostering positive community interactions between the girls and the community members. In this project, in these three projects, the community members were not just involved in, for instance, awareness campaigns, but also they were certain activities such as positive parenting training, village savings and loan association activities that the community members were involved in. And so involving them in this capacity helped in greater awareness. Here, I would also like to specifically highlight a really interesting intervention that took place in Nepal, which is known as Big Sisters. These big sisters were members of the community and were positive female role models for the girls. They acted as cheerleaders for the girls, and they would help the girls in their learning, in their they would act as teachers and educators for the girls as well, but would also come and speak to them, give them advice, help them in their daily living skills. They were particularly instrumental for girls with severe and complex difficulties, and they would help the girls in their daily interactions. They were also helpful for the girls during COVID-19, where they would come to the girls' houses and then teach them, and they would also encourage them to pursue a career in the future. And many girls also spoke about how they would want to, they looked up to the big sisters and they would want to grow up to be like the big sisters. And because the big sisters were part of the community, they had a very positive impact on the community members. The community members would listen to the big sisters, and they were able to kind of generate greater awareness about the education of girls with disabilities, about the rights of girls with disabilities. And all participants, all stakeholders spoke about how instrumental big sisters were in the lives of girls with disabilities. And so this showed how when community members are included into interventions as active participants, that can have such a positive impact on the lives of beneficiaries. Finally, there are some final reflections that I can see a question on whether the big sisters also had disabilities. Some of them did, but and some of them didn't. It really varied and depended on the context, on the specific district that the big sisters were working on. So no, not all of them had disabilities, only some of them did. Some final additional reflections. The use of child functioning module and as well as community mapping helped in identifying a greater number of girls with disabilities. This community mapping was conducted by 11 of the 41 projects, and that really helped in, they went door to door to different houses, and that really helped in identifying girls that would not have been identified otherwise. We also found that a number of stakeholders, such as teachers, spoke about how they struggled in catering to the needs of children with severe and complex needs. And so concentrated efforts for the inclusion of children with complex needs, with severe needs, are needed to ensure that they aren't left behind. When we were interviewing girls with severe and complex needs, they were the ones that needed more targeted interventions for them as well. And so more efforts for their inclusion are needed. Finally, listening to the beneficiaries is central, and participatory methods of photo, voice, and audio prompts helped really capture the needs of girls with disabilities in this study. A lot of these really in-depth insights on the barriers faced by the girls, or the things that they liked about their schools, or their future aspirations, came through the participatory methods of photo, voice, and audio prompts. They helped the girls really participate, really be a part of the research process, and presented to us some really powerful insights into their lives, which we are really thankful for and which were really useful for the study. So that's the final reflection. And thank you so much. Our presentation ends there, and we'll be taking your questions in the end.
Thank you so much for a very rich presentation. We're now going to hear from Nafisa, who is our discussant. So we look forward to your comments, Nafisa, and I think, Lara, you're going to share a slide on Nafisa's behalf, and then there will be a chance for questions. So please do, while Nafisa is talking, I'm sure people have got things that you would like to ask, so please do start putting things into the chat, and then our presenters can be ready to respond to them. So over to you, Nafisa.
Thank you, Pauline, and thank you to FCDO and the implementing partners of the Girls Education Challenge, and of course the evaluation team. Really big congratulations. So today I will just briefly reflect on the findings and how we could take this forward in our practice as champions of change. So I just finished reading this really interesting book, The Covenant of Water by Abraham Verghese. It's a novel based in India that tells a beautiful story of 3 generations of women and their families starting from the early 900s, where marriage and servitude was the only dream for or measure of success for women at that time. And in this novel is a courageous woman, a former child bride and grandmother, who lit this special lamp to mark the birth of her first granddaughter. Now, it's a symbolic act, like defiance against the social norms, because lamps are usually only lit for sons. The lighting of this lamp also serves as a personal message to her granddaughter that she can dream big. There is nothing that she can't do. And this is something that was instilled in me from a very young age, and something I instill in my daughter and every girl with a disability that I come across on my path. But the sad reality is that it takes programs like the Girls Education Challenge to help girls with disabilities know their full value and encourage them to dream of success. So I really love the picture that was also in one of the slides that depicted what is a successful woman with a disability. I fall short on the wearing of the lipsticks part, but my daughter, if she has her way, will change this soon. And this word picture is also of a successful woman, really reminds us about that girls are just girls regardless of their disability first. They equate education with success and a bright future. The findings also tell us that having people who see their abilities and the potential encourages them to attend school. And it is important to have female role models that tell them, if I can, you can, and if they can, I can. And that's a message that I used to tell myself when I was younger. Not all Girls Education Challenge projects targeted girls with disabilities. I noticed that in the findings. And in fact, most education programs neglect to target children with disabilities or only focus on those who are very easy to reach. And I'm hoping that the findings of this evaluation will inspire others to take up the challenge. For this to happen, we need to address an issue that came up was that there were resource constraints which held implementers back from supporting girls with disabilities. If we want to address this, I feel that at least 5% of budget should be allocated to system-level interventions and disability-specific interventions to improve learning outcomes and participation of girls. Girls with disabilities and their families need livelihood and financial support. And not all of the projects really focused on this. They need transport and technical experts, specialist expertise and resources are needed to support students with severe disabilities. And technology can also be a real game changer here to support children with severe disabilities and complex disabilities. However, more investment is required. So how do we finance this? How do we get budget for all these things? We need to listen, I think, first to the needs of girls and their families and teachers, and draw on the collective experience of organizations working in disability inclusive educations and also working in girls' education. And what are some of the key ingredients for adequate support and inclusion and success? We also need good data, and it's really pleasing to see the use of the Washington Group Child Functioning Module. I think this is a lot more comprehensive for this younger age group than it's good that we use the Washington Short Group set of questions too, but the Child Functioning Module is a lot more comprehensive. We also need to operationalize and contextualize the tools and approaches that have mushroomed up in the last 7 years. And I think this is also the Child Functioning Module has really taken root. One of the other tools that have come up is a tool that was developed by Light for the World with the Action Aid and the Global Campaign for Education. It's a gender responsive and disability inclusive education budgeting toolkit. And we co-designed this with 5 other sub-Saharan countries. The ministries of education and finance were engaged in this. We also, and I think this is another finding that stood out for me, is that we need to go deeper. Teacher training is important around universal design for learning and just general inclusion practices, but we also need more in-depth specific support for students who need Braille or sign language, or even augmentative and alternative communication for students with cerebral palsy. But these specific areas need attention, and specialists are required. I sometimes feel that we need to do a gender analysis linked to specific disability groups to gather evidence of what the real gaps are, challenges are, because disability is not a homogenous group. And with it, I think it will also illuminate to us what things are required to improve learning and participation. So what really stood out for me is the importance of listening to the voices of girls with disabilities. I really, because I love the diagrams, I love the photo voice methodology. Yes, it's important to engage organizations of persons with disabilities, but remember, the patriarchy runs deep. We need to listen more to girls and women with disabilities themselves to find solutions and to know what matters most to them. So I hope that moving forward, we'll let open and honest conversations about the gaps and enablers with girls with disabilities and their peers, that's girls without disabilities, be a guiding light as we journey on leaving no girl behind. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nafisa, for those really important points. And I know that you've been championing these issues for many years. And it's great to see some reports like this that are dedicated to disability, which I think, as Nidhi and you know very well, is probably sort of been too long in the waiting. And nice to see things like the Girls' Education Challenge really putting it at the centre. And I think that's thanks to all the efforts that you've been making to see this to realisation. So thank you. We were trying to put up, sorry for the sort of disruption in the chat, we were trying to put up a slide that had the picture that Lyra showed in her PowerPoint that was really powerful of the drawing. That is in the report, so please do look at the report. There's a sort of even more of a incentive to go and look at the report and find that. Sorry for the technological glitches. Please do come in with any questions or comments. I don't know if we've got any of the implementing partners on the call who participated in the study. It would be, if so, it would be lovely to hear from you. Obviously, your work has been absolutely vital. And Emma from the fund manager, I don't know if you also have anything you want to share while we're waiting to see what people are getting warmed up with their questions.
No, well, thank you very much. I know there's a question that's gone up. I'll just say thanks very much quickly to the team here. I think this really complements all the work that the Girls' Education Challenge tries to do and achieves with working with girls with disabilities. I know there's some questions in the chat, so I'll hand over, but we're also planning to do more work together with the Independent Evaluator, exploring some of these ideas around girls' disabilities, their voices, and how actually do we make education programming fit for purpose when actually we're working with a diverse population. So I look forward to that and sharing that later on. Thanks, Pauline.
Thank you so much, Emma. I don't know, Nidhi, do you want to lead on seeing what's in the chat and coordinating amongst you rather than me but reading it and then you repeating? It's probably easier that way.
I'll do that. Thanks,
in case there's anything new that comes up.
Thank you, Pauline. I'll do that. Larry was very good at answering the first Big Sisters question during the presentation itself. That was pretty impressive. So I'm going to let you take the second one also, because I know we've been working on a paper and you've been in touch with implementing partners. So the question is, how do the young women become Big Sisters, and was this initiative across all 3 countries? So first, Larry, you, and then I can add in.
Okay. Thank you so much for this question. Big Sisters was an intervention just in Nepal, conducted by VSO Nepal. These were community volunteers. They became Big Sisters through training sessions that were conducted by VSO. And so what was the other part? Did you? Did you come across any interventions which aim to help girls with disabilities specifically take on this role? So this intervention in itself, the training session, helped girls with disabilities who were a part of the VSO Nepal project as well. If they wanted to be big sisters in the future, then the project would support them. But for now, the project did try to include more girls with disabilities, women with disabilities as big sisters, but then it really depended on who was volunteering and, for instance, the time and logistical constraints as well. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. And also we did hear some of the girls talking about how they would like to become big sisters. So one's hoping that if the project is sustained, or is there a community way of sustaining this project where they can take on those responsibilities? So thank you for that, Larry. Louisa, in the same question, poses a question for Nafisa, and she talks about, you mentioned needing teacher support. Do you feel this is something that is increasingly prioritized in policies in developing nations that can help? So I have huge responses on teacher support, etc. But I'll let Nafisa come in. Nafisa, please do go ahead.
Yes, thanks, Nidhi. I don't have the research to back it, but I can tell you that I do think that teacher support is really necessary. I do feel like we are often overloading teachers with just more and more additional things for them to do. And I am feeling that it's necessary to kind of broaden the cadre of support for teachers. And that can be addressed by either intersectoral collaboration. But in many countries, there are not people who are occupational therapists or physiotherapists or speech therapists in the countries that predominantly we work in, like for the world. And I think that that is often the support that is required. What we do is you can add support outside in the community, and that could be done by training up people with disabilities who are fluent in sign language to support a student in the classroom. Although I would say it's probably better to get more teachers with disabilities who are sign language fluent or native sign language users to be in the teachers. But I think that those are some of the strategies. But I do think I can see that the need for support is there and the request for support is there, particularly in the context that we work where classes are student pupil ratios around 100 plus. It's too much to expect for a teacher to do everything.
Thanks, Nafisa. And I think absolutely we both agree on that, how essential it is to support teachers. And there's some really interesting examples. The itinerant teacher model in Malawi, the IARC's Inclusive Education Resource Centers in Ethiopia, etc. And it is interesting to draw on these examples from within the Global South to inform debates and programs within other contexts. In the research project here too, in the GEC II evaluation, again, teachers were very much talking about the need for support to help manage the large class sizes, but also the huge amount of curriculum that they need to get through. And I think just keeping these factors in mind and what that support could look like, and how does teacher training then help with collaboration rather than thinking about teaching and learning as a very single individual adult-driven enterprise is really important. And I think this brings up to the second question from Penny, who says, was there any opposition from the schools or communities to supporting more girls with disabilities into schools? I think it's important to acknowledge that when we went in, the interventions had already been in place for a few years. So we did not encounter that. And girls with disabilities themselves actually reflected on how they were becoming stronger advocates for negotiating with their parents that they wanted to go for higher education. So that was a very interesting thing which we were hearing about how these girls themselves were becoming agents for change. Also, it very much ties in from other research work we've been doing in other contexts where teachers no longer necessarily actively object to the inclusion of children with disabilities. I think what they are in many cases always talking about is how they need to be supported to make that feasible. The human rights agenda and the fact that many of these countries, mostly all countries, have signed up to big international conventions and have national laws and policies which support inclusion makes it a very fertile place to see change happening at the teacher level also. And I think that really should be acknowledged. It's not is the teachers only always pushing back. I'm just going to read through the next question. Oh, Sophia has a question here. I love this question because I'm going to definitely pass it to Larry when Sophia poses it. It is, can you clarify for a non-quant specialist some of the quant? Sophia, is the question down here somewhere? Yes. Okay. Sorry, I'm scrolling through my chat at the same time. Pauline, have you spotted the question, please? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so it's about statistical significance. Can you clarify for non-quant specialists to the point that you were making, Lara, about the statistical significance in the terms of the graph?
So statistical significance of results basically mean that the result that you have gotten is not due to chance. That means statistical, that's what statistical significance is in layman terms. But what this basically means is that the data was not that robust for us to say that the learning outcomes have increased significantly. So that's basically what that means. That there is a chance that it could have occurred by chance.
Larabe, can I real quickly ask, because you said something about it being statistically significant under a certain context, but not statistically significant under another. Could you explain what that part meant? Sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So what I said was that it was statistically significant when we took the data for all of the projects together. But when we added project-specific weights, so project-specific weights were dependent on the sample of girls with disabilities. Each project will have different samples of girls with disabilities. Some will have high samples, some will have low samples. When we add project-specific weights based on the number of girls with disabilities that were included in all of the projects, then the results were not statistically significant. And this could be because there were two projects that had a very high number of girls with disabilities and were high performing projects. So the changes that we found at the portfolio level could be occurring because of those two high performing projects. And that's why we could have been getting statistically significant results. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. That's awesome. So much clearer. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Larry. Just going on to the second question posed by Sophia, I can take that very quickly. I think it's very difficult. It is impossible to draw a causal impact between this intervention and the effect that was happening. So I think we would not go down that route at all. But if there were limited budgets, there is a huge, I think, cry for making sure budgets are appropriate to the kind of policy interventions that people want seeing and the programs that people design. So they need to be adequately funded. That's a really central point. But I think the whole presentation was very much focused on where would you recommend investing. So recommend investing in communities as partners rather than just awareness raising programs, very much focusing on the fact that teachers need support, not simply training, very much focused on the fact that getting the basics right. We were very much surprised by how many projects were not focusing on simple infrastructure issues, which remained a huge challenge, not simply for girls with disabilities, but definitely for all girls. So lack of hygienic toilets, the basic rights, getting ventilation in classrooms, getting appropriate lighting in classroom. I think that's where we would say really think through investments and make these much more focused on the needs of what the community needs, make them contextually sensitive rather than assuming that one size of an intervention fits everybody. The next question is on methods. It's very much looking at, Basirat poses a question around what kind of practicalities, what lessons can we draw from the methodological approach we adopted? And how could we include more girls with complex and intellectual disabilities? So I'll try and answer the second part really quickly. We try to make our approaches very flexible in the data collection in terms of both training the research data collection team, but also, for instance, we just did not rely on photo voice. We relied also on audio notes for girls who are unable to take photographs. So we try and then adapt there. For girls with more complex cognitive needs, we actually did not have any in our sample because they were not, and that's one of the things we raised in the presentation, that the kind of spread of disabilities we were looking for, assuming that would be there, wasn't necessarily there in the samples. We really can't reflect on if our methods would have worked or not. And also it would have meant really taking into account the needs of the girls. So I think we can't answer that particular question, though we did have backup of methods. So very much a mosaic of methods available to us, which we employed as needed. Okay, I'm just scrolling down the question list, unless, Pauline, you have a way of clustering them.
I haven't as yet. I'm just, I will start to do so because I think there's lots of great ones here. So
Yeah.
maybe if you take the next one, Nidhi.
I will. Were there any? So the next one is from Rahula, who says, were there any elements of comparison amongst different selected cases, specifically on how different contexts and cultural dynamics responded to a specific girls with disabilities intervention, for example? That's a really good one. I think we allude to that in our presentation. Larry, would you want to take that on?
Yeah, thank you so much. That was really interesting. So there were certain interventions for which we could see that there was a level of comparison between all three contexts. So for instance, vocational training and life skills training had such an impact on girls in all three of the contexts, where in all three contexts, the girls spoke about an increase in their aspirations. And for instance, the barriers that were faced by them, such as transport issues, feelings of safety, gender norms, they were quite similar in all three of the countries. And so the community awareness interventions and the interventions for the parents as well, the parental trainings, that had similar impact in all three countries, because in terms, they are quite different in terms of their context, but the kind of gender and social norms and notions of disability that were restricting girls in all three contexts were a little similar. And so the impact of the community awareness campaigns and the individual interventions for fostering for empowering the girls were similar. I think Pauline wants to add something.
No, I was just going to say, Lara, there's where you can see specific comments in the chat. Could you just maybe respond? I think, for example, Nafisa had a question on which of the two projects. So, Nidhi, in terms of a clustering of three of the comments that I think maybe fit together, from Eunice, Mariam, and I think there was another one from Nafisa about which relate to stigma and labelling and the use of the Washington Group questions. So the issues around stigma leading to children being hidden from the public. Did you sort of find anything about that? What are the sort of boundaries of what was identified as a child with disabilities or otherwise? And then Nafisa's question, which was about whether the implementing partners used the information that came from these data to actually adapt their interventions in any way.
Do you want me to take that, Larry? I'll take those, okay, and you can add in. So absolutely, that's a really good point. All the implementing partners were seeking out girls who were out of school, and hence they did not just use the CFM, they used community mapping methods. So the point about, were they able to find the ones who were hidden? They made an effort. Their aim was to look for the most marginalized girls, and they were the target beneficiaries. So remember, we were just evaluation and intervention these people were already wanting to give or being part of. So many of the projects use community mapping methods and the CFM, which I thought was really powerful in identifying girls with disabilities who might be hidden. So I think that was really important to acknowledge there. The other point about how do you draw a line between who's a disabled person and who's not? Of course, disability is a continuum, but then there is also need, this is where I always think about Martha and Minow's dilemma of difference, where how important it is to identify a need, but also the identification of the need shouldn't become an act of stigmatizing, but identifying a need is also really useful for responding to a need. And disability is definitely a continuum. The way we approach disability and the way the IPs were approaching disability was very much driven by GEC's own intention of adopting the UNCRPD and the CFM, the Washington Group questions. There is a cutoff. It acknowledges functional difficulties, acknowledges all of us are faced with functional disability difficulties in how we participate in society at various points, but there is a cutoff, and that's the cutoff we used in identifying who we saw as disabled. But totally take your point about the need for looking at intersectionalities. But I think the reality and pragmatics of making sure we're including the ones who are marginalized is also really important.
Nidhi, I was looking at the chat, so I don't think you just responded to this, but sorry if you did. There were a couple of comments that have just come in about whether there have been concerns about excluding boys with disabilities. I think maybe this probably is there are more things in the chat, but we probably have to close after this, so we'll finish with the boys.
And that is always a very good question, to finish with the boys. Sadly, or yeah, our focus was, the project partners we were working with were very much focused on girls with disabilities and their interventions, and the interventions were very much designed for girls with disabilities. Rather difficult for me to make bold claims on what was happening with boys with disabilities, I must admit, but one would hope that there are ripple effects of these interventions on all persons with disabilities. And hopefully one would hope that having trained teachers who know how to respond to children with disabilities in the classroom or more sensitive community will have ripple impact on the participation of all those with disabilities, boys or girls.
Thank you so much. We are coming to an end now, and there have been such wonderful questions. Again, I think thanks to such a rich presentation and the comments from Nafisa. So sorry we haven't quite been able to respond to them all, but I think please do go and look at the report. I'm not sure if the summary is on the website yet. If it isn't, it will be very soon. And there are a couple of blogs that have been put in the chat. I think after the call, there will be the recording sent around to everybody who signed up, and colleagues are happy to share the PowerPoint, and also in that email we can also share the blogs and report links. So please do, hopefully this has whetted your appetite to go and read more. So thank you all so much, everybody. Just while we're here on a GEC call, just to let you know that study, so as we know, that was the 4th study. The 5th study is currently under preparation, and we will be having a webinar on the 19th of September. The focus of this is on leaving no girl behind, education pathways beyond formal schooling. Of course, this relates to children with disabilities, girls with disabilities, as well as other forms of marginalisation. So I'm sure that the audience here will also be interested in this, so please do join us if you can. I think Sandra has already, or is put the link in the chat for signing up for that. So thank you all so much again, and particularly to the presenters and our discussants. Hopefully see you in September, if not before.